on? Okay, so this thing is on? Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Adrian and I am a designer.
Grüezi zusammen, my name is Flurin and I'm a front-end developer. And today we're going to talk about designing in a browser, just like Stephen said. But designing a browser is not really the right thing to say because we are going to talk about designing code. And when we mean designing code, we mean handwritten code. But before we go into that a little bit deeper, these are all just means to an end. Because our goal is to design websites as systems. And up until now, in the current workflow, we're designing them as pictures of systems.
And a lot of that goes back to how we teach and learn design. So I went to design school mid-2000s, so a while back. And what I was taught there, as Stephen said, is a print design workflow. And then I finished my school and I started working at ad agencies. And it turned out that everyone just sort of copied and pasted this workflow onto web projects. So this workflow looked like this. And I'm sure this is familiar to many of you. So I, as a designer, would get an assignment and I do what designers do. I design, so I focus on how does this look, how does this feel. And when I was happy with it, I'd sell it to a client. And after the client was happy with it, I'd just chuck it over the fence to a developer. Bye-bye.
Super. That kind of made for unhappy developers. Because when I got such a design, I was kind of stuck with it because it was already sold. And I was stuck with a design that had functional problems and hard-to-fill requirements. And the only thing I could do was I kind of had to go back to the designer and say, yeah, man, we can't do some of this stuff. We have to change some of it.
Yeah, that's not really cool, because you're kind of breaking my concept when you do that.
Yeah, well, it's either that or we make the web go boom.
Probably better not to do that.
So we have a workflow that doesn't really work for the web. And in part, that's because of the tools we used. For many years, we've been using Photoshop or Illustrator, but not because they were the best tool for the job. They were just the least terrible. But this talk is really not about tools.
No, it's not, thank God. Because we don't think we should define ourselves by the tools that we use. And I, for one, I don't want to be a tool, so let's not do that. And we also think we shouldn't define ourselves by what we make with our deliverables. And we definitely shouldn't define ourselves by wearing hipster glasses, even though I would have been good at that. No, what we ask is a fundamental question about our professions.
I mean, what is a developer anyway?
I was going to ask you that. Or what is a designer? Because at their core, both front-end developers and designers are problem solvers. And our perspectives define how we approach problems to find solutions.
And developers and designers each do that in their own unique way, because we have different skill sets. But that does mean there is a gap. And in this gap, problems arise.
And that's because the gap is a very murky, confusing place. And now when people get confused, they tend to make assumptions about their situation. And in our case, we make assumptions about each other's skill sets. So you'll get designers who look at something and say, well, I can kludge this for now, because the developer, he'll fix it later. Or a developer will look at something that makes no sense and he'll say, well, the designer must have thought about it at some point. And in the end, everyone just kind of shrugs.
And that's a source of frustration, because when designers look at the final product, they will not see the thing they designed. And for developers, when they sometimes have to build things that completely make no sense whatsoever. So the current workflow doesn't really do anything about this. Development and design are silos. And that also means that our skills are kept separate. And that means that we can't use them to their full potential. What we need to do is we need to bridge the gap.
And in order to bridge the gap, what we want is skill sets that have overlap across professions. So what we want is a broad knowledge base with a deep speciality. And we like to call these skill sets T-shaped skill sets. The gold chains are optional, but encouraged. And we do that in order to bring together our expertise with as few gaps as possible.
So we have to ask ourselves, can we change the workflow? That might be tricky because change is always uncomfortable to people. And people will say to you, yeah, but this is how we always did it. Well, and then you should think, okay, but sometimes you just shouldn't listen to people, because if we did, we would still be stuck with brighter oil lamps and faster horse carriages. So, but when we talk about change, we have, of course, put the money where our mouth is. And Adrian and I, we got the opportunity to do that, to change the workflow, when we worked with this client. It was actually, we were working for the client, we were doing front-end development for them, and I'm going to call this client Smith Incorporated. Well, actually, it was quite a sizable client, so I'm going to call him Mega Smith. They had a website with around 10K pages in 12 different languages, millions of page views per month, and they wanted to do a redesign. So they asked me, hey, Flurin, do you know a good designer who could help us out here? And I said, yeah, sure, I do. Here's Adrian.
And so I was briefed on this project and was really happy about it. And so when I was briefed, I basically started doing what I always did. I'm a designer. I design stuff. So I started the design phase, which basically meant I retreated into my cave and started making stuff pretty. Now, a few weeks later, we had the presentation date, the first one, and we were ushered into a meeting room and all the stakeholders were present. And I started my presentation, and by slide 1, we had already failed.
And we failed miserably. And it wasn't because it didn't work or the design wasn't right for their business. They just didn't understand what they were seeing.
And it would have been easy for us to kind of gloss over that, to ignore that problem. Because we could have said, well, you guys, you don't need to understand design because, you know, that's what you're paying me for. But there's one problem with that. It's very hard for people to see value in things they don't understand. And it's very hard to sell something to someone when he doesn't see the value of it. So we got back from this slightly awkward meeting and we asked ourselves, how did this happen?
And we quickly came to the conclusion that it wasn't actually the client's fault, because what we showed them was a picture of a website. And that picture included all kinds of weird instructions about interactions. To them, it was about as clear as an IKEA manual. So for the next presentation, we had to really change our tactics. So what I did, I took Adrian's static comps, I sliced them like it was 1999, I put them into HTML, added a fixed background, a sticky header, made it all work, added some pepperoni mushrooms, and on the second presentation, we just blew their minds.
Hooray, mission accomplished.
We found a new workflow! Woohoo!
Not so fast. This turned out to be a very short-lived success, and this is what we now call the middle ground. Now what we did, as Flurin described, we recombined the static comp in HTML. Nowadays, we could have used a tool. I mean, there's InVision and UXPin, there's dozens you could have used. But basically what all this has in common, this middle ground, is that you do the visual design first, and afterwards you just sort of slather on the interaction sauce. And that kind of has some problems. Because mainly we're still working with still images, and still images still suck. And they suck mainly because changes are very hard. Now, I used to work in Illustrator, so I would have to make a change. I go to Illustrator, make the change, save it for web, go to Photoshop, slice it up, then save it for web, go to a text editor, insert it into HTML, then I save that, go to a browser, clear cache, refresh, and I notice I made a typo in the browser, and I go back to Illustrator and do it again. And then there's another issue, namely we cannot make images responsive. And these apps, they can't really help you with that either. So you would have to make separate comps for every screen you want to show. Actually, we checked on this. We looked at InVision's feature list. The word responsive does not appear in it. And comps are very hard to maintain. Because let's say we get a client today, and when I'm done and the client is happy, I call Flurin and I hand it off to him.
Yes, and I start building the front end, and someone else started building the back end, and eventually we'll ship it, and there's going to be a big launch party. Everybody's happy. But let's fast forward 1 year. In that year, the client asked to do a lot of tiny changes, and we do this directly in the HTML or CSS. It can be a font change, maybe change the picture format or something like that. But after that year, the client wants to do a bigger change, so he gets Adrian on board again.
So I'm really happy to have a returning client. But then the problem becomes very apparent when my design comp doesn't match the live site anymore. So before I can actually start work on something new, I first have to invest my own time to make them line up again.
And that's, yeah, stupid work, isn't it?
It's dumb work.
So we talked about some of the design issues we have in, but there are also issues for developers because images are still guesswork for us. You have to pick colors, you have to do measurements, you have to look at font sizes. And what you're actually trying to do, you're trying to reverse engineer to infer a system from a static image. You're not building a system from the ground up. So the bottom line for this middle ground is that it's the same for developers. It's actually more work for designers.
And we all know how much designers hate more work.
Sure, you get a better presentation tool because you can show something working in a browser, but it doesn't really address anything that we talked about before, anything about the workflow. So we really wanted a better solution.
So we thought, there must have been other very smart people who have run into similar problems. People who have come up with clever ideas to, create HTML and CSS for you if you wanted that. And it turns out that did happen. I mean, we could have started using Adobe Muse or Webflow or Macaw or Scarlet.
Yes, and as a front-end developer, I'm going to tell you could use them, but I don't think you should. And I'm going to tell you why. The first thing is that it puts a thing between you and what you're making. That means there is also still a handoff. You're just like in the Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop days, you will design something and then you will hand it off to a front-end developer or another developer. So you don't bridge the gap. You don't do anything to improve the workflow. And it creates an excuse for designers to stay ignorant of what the web is actually made of. And we all know it's kittens. So there's another problem. All of these apps are what you see is what you get apps. And of course, they appeal to designers because you can drag arbitrary boxes on a blank canvas. But that's also a problem because you're still stuck with design by eyeball. Remember, our goal is to design systems. And what you're still doing, you're designing instances of elements instead of building such a site-wide system. And all of these apps, they convert your design to HTML and CSS. But that means that you have no control over what comes out. And if that output is crap, it will always be crap, every time, forever and ever and ever. And when I, as a front-end developer, get these HTML and CSS, I can't really work with that because I can't iterate, I cannot work on top of that because when you export it again, you will have a new output. And quite frankly, we as front-end developers, we are not a cleanup crew. And all of these apps, they all have proprietary formats, which means they're closed source. And when I work with 10 different designers, and each one of them uses a different app, I have to buy these apps, and I have to learn how to use these apps. And for me, that does not scale at all.
And then there's the issue that we live in an era of subscription-based licensing. Because when we as designers stop paying the companies who make these apps, we're basically locked out of our own work, which is a bit weird.
And then there's what happened to Adobe Fireworks. Or more recently, Macaw changed course within 16 months of initial launch. They're now building another tool called Scarlet. So apps change and apps die.
And when they die, basically all the time you invested in learning how the app works is lost. It's wasted time. So I remember how we used to talk about how it's about perspectives as front-end developers and designers. When we learn something, we want something that adds to our perspectives and builds our T-shaped skill set. And there he is again. So what we want is we want to learn something that transcends apps. So that by definition means apps not really the way forward. And then we thought, why would you want to use an app when code is amazeballs? Now this is a scientific fact. If you want proof of that, just go to codeisamazeballs.com. Yes, that is a real site. But in the meantime, I'm going to tell you why it's amazeballs. So I'm going to paraphrase Steve Jobs here. Coding will teach you how to think. And in our case, as designers, it'll teach us to think of our work as a system. And it'll help us to think of function before we worry about aesthetics. And designing in code gives an immense amount of control to designers. And this is a big deal. Because before, we were always sort of dependent on how good is this front-end developer really at interpreting my work? I mean, yeah, so some are better, some are worse. But when we design in code, we use the same language. And so the intent of the designer is very clear to the developer, which makes the end result, the product, look much like the design, which makes me very happy as a designer.
And clients will be happier too, because having a design in code will make a really powerful presentation tool. You can show the client basically a working website, and he can actually click through it. And the cool thing is that he can do that on desktop, on tablet, or on mobile.
And that's actually because we can design responsively from the very start. Because designing in code is device agnostic, so we can design for all form factors if we want to. Because let's be honest, how many devices come out each year? We actually looked this up. It's about 6,000 according to OpenSignal. That means there's 16 potentially new screen dimensions you have to worry about every day. Now imagine making comps for all those in Photoshop. Good luck to you. And another benefit is that we can, as designers, can finally create real type systems. Because we love making styles coherent and related. And we can do that by design now and not just have them reverse engineered by a developer. No offense.
None taken. But this also means that it takes out a lot of the guesswork for us again. We don't have to go through multiple Photoshop files with hundreds of layers with very obscure names to figure out which one of these font sizes is the correct font for the H2. And when you design in code, you're just writing HTML and CSS. And that's plain text. And plain text is a format old enough to be your dad. And your children will probably still be able to read it as well. And that means your work will stay accessible to you for a long time to come. So designers in the room, I have a question for you. How many of you have gotten requests from a developer about missing hover states? Show your hands. No.
Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed. It happens to be.
Okay. Well, when you design in code, that's kind of built in. And that means we, as front developers, we don't have to search for it because we just inspect the element and see what this hover state is. I also got a question for you developers in the room. How often do you get a design that with missing fonts? Raise your hands. That's quite a bit more. When you design in code, you actually get the web fonts delivered to your front door. And there's another benefit. We can use real version control when we work with code. Because, let's face it, save as, that's not version control. Because this is a Where's Waldo for front-end development. Yeah, the last one is an actual file name I encountered a month ago.
It's not mine.
Well, when you design in code, that means that code is, you can use through version control system like Git. And because code is comparable, we can actually see how something changed throughout our project. And when we have written good commit messages, we can even see the rationale behind it. We can see why something changed. And that makes it so much more understandable for everyone involved. So why did we do things? And this is going to be a thing of the past. There's no more conversion of units because we all use the same units.
And designers should be really excited about these units because the units are great because we finally get to use relative units. And as a side benefit, we get to take that pixel perfect school of design out to a very quiet spot in the woods and gently shoot it. That's like one of my dreams. Because we can finally now create relationships between dimensions. And that goes towards creating a system. Now when we create systems, we can also use things like variables, which are basically like swatches in Photoshop or Illustrator, and you could use them for colors if you wanted to. But you could also use them for font sizes or measurements.
Media queries come to mind.
Media queries, also a good one. And where a variable is only one reusable value, you can also recycle entire blocks of code if you wanted to. In CSS, you can use mix-ins and extends. And in HTML, you could use templates. And the great thing about that for designers is that you have to change something once, and it'll change everywhere. Which means you won't have to do that much stupid work. You won't have to go through all your layers and then sort of match all the elements by eye and by hand. And of course, when you do it in Photoshop, you'll probably miss one or two. And then you get the angry call from the developer who's like, did you mean 20 or 21 pixels here? So all of this, it goes towards creating better consistency. And better consistency makes for a better system. Now, designing in code is not perfect. It's definitely not a magic bullet. It's not a miracle solution. Because, let's be very honest with each other, if you are a shit designer, you will still be a shit designer when you design in code.
But there is some good news here. Because even if you are a shit designer, as Adrian so eloquently puts it, it will still offer you a tremendous amount of benefits. As we said before, it's about bridging the gap, and this tweet by our friend Hayden Pickering illustrates it quite well. It's about co-designing. It's not about doing each other's job. We are all still specialists, and we can't do the entire job on our own. So, as front-end developers and designers, we have to safeguard against the idea that we can skip design or front-end development. Because designing code is not a shortcut. And it's really important, so I'm going to repeat that. Designing code is not a shortcut. We are merely advocating an integrated approach to cut down on waste and frustration. There are some rules involved, though. It does mean we'll all be playing on the same playground. And that means we all need to learn to share. The don't touch my stuff attitude just really doesn't cut it anymore. And besides, as front-end developers, we always change something in the design when we were implementing it.
Yeah, thanks for that. But I do agree, we should have left that attitude of don't touch my stuff on a playground back when we were 6. So when we talk about sharing, developers are already very good at this. They are very natural collaborators. And the cool thing is that designers now finally get to play along. They get to do that too. Because designing in code is naturally accessible to everyone involved. And that means there will be a very fluid exchange of input and ideas throughout the project. So now that we've mentioned all the benefits, everyone's like, yeah, that sounds peachy. But how do you put this in practice? And so this is the model that we are currently using. So basically from the top down, we start with idea gathering, then we make prototypes, we create design code, production code, we ship it, and then forget about it. Now these look like they are, segmented and they're hard lines, but there will be some fluidity and overlap in these, and there will be some back and forthing too. So what we want when we start a project is we want to gather as many ideas as possible. But because the volume will be very high, we need them to be very low cost. So what we want to start with is a high volume of cheap ideas. And as we work through the funnel, we will end up with a few tested, solid ideas that we've invested much in, so they are high value ideas now. So let's start with the idea gathering stage. Now what we do, the best way for us, your mileage may vary, is sketching. Because everyone can sketch. It's a very level playing field.
Exactly, because I can draw boxes on paper just as well as any designer. Okay, maybe not, but even our clients can join in sometimes, because we're doing this to figure out how something should work and how elements relate to each other. We're not doing this to figure out how it should look.
No, so what we're after is a low-cost, high-speed representation of what we want to make. And for designers, that means we have to totally ignore aesthetics to begin with.
And that's where they sometimes get confused. The thing we hear them say is, but I already know how I'm going to make this look.
And I'm going to call bullshit on that. Because you can't know how something should look until you know how something should work. And what we want when we sketch, we want high functional fidelity and low visual fidelity for a very good reason. Because we want to avoid falling in love with a visual solution over a functional solution. So we need to keep an open mind in this stage. And sketching for us is exploring, so it's not about nailing stuff down.
Okay, good. So now we have got a lot of sketches and ideas how to solve a problem. But all of these solutions are just theoretical solutions. We need to weed out the bad ones, and that's why we build low-cost prototypes in code. These could be built by anyone in the team. Could be a designer, could be a developer.
Or together.
Yeah, or you could do it together. We build these prototypes in tools like JSBin or CodePen, and because it means we can start without having to build any scaffolding code or a framework or something like that. We can just start coding, make our prototype. Because we build low-cost prototypes and we build them very early on, we can test early and we can test often, because without testing, you're just guessing. And at this stage, we're mostly concerned about how does something work and how does it behave. And to figure that out, we actually do a little bit of peer testing. When I create something, I show it to Adrian and he clicks through it, looks, maybe this can work, or we have to change something. Or we do it the other way around. And sometimes we even ask users and clients to look at it as well. So when you're doing this, you will find out that many of your ideas don't work. But because we kept the investment for the initial ideas very low, the throwing them away should be really pain-free.
Yeah, and to keep them pain-free, we get to use all kinds of hacks. Isn't that nice? It's refreshing. Because they don't have to be good. They only have to prove the concept of what you're trying to show. And we also don't want to polish them just yet, because over time, if the idea is proven, we will iterate these dirtiness and the hacks out. And also that means that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we want to make something, because we can make use of other people's T-shaped skill sets. Because go online and you'll find really smart people who've made the perfect grid for your project, or posted a snippet that you can directly adapt to your project, or who've written plugins that are, just perfect. So by now, we have a pretty good idea of how something behaves. But prototypes, they're still kind of separate floaty items. They're like islands. And now the time has come to combine them into a system. And what we end up with is this. This is a bagel, just for reference.
Not a donut.
Not a donut. And it's good. I mean, it has structure and some nutritional value, I think. And you could eat it like this if you were really hungry. But it could be so much better. For instance, you could enhance it with cream cheese. And that's basically what we're trying to do now. We're trying to enhance the prototypes with visual design. I don't recommend you try to enhance your design with cream cheese. I did, it's not good. But the visual design part is very, very important, because how something looks strongly influences how your user interacts with it. And you can elevate already pretty decent interactions, tested interactions, into amazing interactions. So for designers, that means we'll sketch again. And just like the initial idea gathering, we try to keep the initial investment low. And we iterate these sketches. So we eliminate the stuff that doesn't work, the stuff that doesn't fit, that doesn't look right. And after a while, we will end up with a short list of ideas we want to implement. And when we want to implement them, we implement them in code. Now, quick side note on that. Don't really worry about supporting browsers at this stage. Me, for one, I only use one browser. I only work in Chrome. And I do that because it's available on many platforms and supports most of the cool stuff. But that's side note. Back to implementing design in code. When you've implemented it, you will start to iterate this code. And by now, I have said the word iterate maybe 7,000 times, give or take. So you must know that we like to iterate. And we like to iterate often, because every iteration is a refining step for us. And this is actually how we build up the fidelity in a project. So we can build design code based on prototypes, which we based on sketches.
And finally, we can build production code on top of our design code. Now, when you work with designing code, you may notice that the design process is longer. That's because you're building a solid base. You're avoiding snags and hang-ups at a very early stage. But you will notice that the overall project can be shorter and yield much better results. So back to the funnel. We now have a working, good-looking cream cheese bagel. But what do we have to do to actually ship it? A large part of that is quality assurance. We have to look at performance, we have to look at accessibility, we have to look at maintainability. So that means we have to do a lot of testing and maybe some refactoring, because we have to make it browser and device compatible. We may have to refactor the code to make it more modular so that it can be maintained in the long run. And we may have to iron out the last hacks that are still in there. Now, some of these things can, or are logically done by developers, but most of these things can also be done together with a designer. Because in the end, we are all responsible for shipping a consistent, good product. So, and when we ship, we're kind of done.
Hang on. I see some of you, and you're skeptical about this. Because, you think you've spent your entire career working in Photoshop and Illustrator, and basically we're now telling you to chuck that overboard, to just forget about that?
I don't think we are. You will still need Photoshop and Illustrator to edit photos and to illustrate.
That's what they're made for. But the point is that many designers are very protective of their ingrained workflows. And they'll come up to us after talks like this, and they'll say things like, designing code, that sounds really cool, but that's too limiting for me, man. Because I need to start with a blank canvas. I need to start without constraints. And then I kind of look at them funny and say, please stop saying stuff like that. Because what you're doing is perpetuating the myth that designers pull ideas out of thin air the same way that magicians pull rabbits out of hats. Because good design is hard work. Good design is a science. And you're kind of selling yourself short there. And let's be honest, design needs constraints. Without constraints, you're basically making art. And when you start a project, there are always constraints. And sometimes it's a client that calls you up and asks, hey man, my wife had this idea. Can we add a dancing hippo in there somewhere? And even if that doesn't happen, there will always be technical constraints in every single project. And if you're designing without technical constraints in mind, basically what you're saying is, fuck it, this is not my problem.
And that means that someone else has to solve these constraint issues later on. And quite frankly, that just makes you an asshole designer. So as developer, we really have to ask ourselves, do we want to work with these people? Well, we may not have to for long. Because will these designers still work in this industry in a few years? Think about it. Web design students graduating today, they will learn how to code in school. So the only way to stay ahead of them is by adapting. And of course, by making use of your years of experience.
So now that we've finally managed to offend some people,
and given some unsolicited career advice,
let's get into tips to actually get started on this. So for designers, the first thing you're going to have to do is leave your comfort zone. And that seems like a big deal, but after you take the plunge, it's a lot less scary. And you'll find out that coding is not the Matrix, no matter what your mom says. Because you are not Neo's intellectually challenged cousin. Designers as a group are pretty smart people. And as our host, Stephen Hay, actually said before, we managed to learn thousands of weird Photoshop buttons and menus, so we can learn HTML tags and CSS rules. It's not harder, it's just different. And the cool thing about designing in code is you can actually learn by doing. You can just start hacking somewhere. That does unfortunately mean sooner or later you'll run into the learning curve. And I can only comment on this from personal experience, because I went from being code illiterate to be able to participate and have a very basic understanding in about 6 months. I'm not an especially smart guy, but your mileage may vary. And I can understand that for some of you, 6 months is a very sizable investment. So when you do decide to make this investment, try to find a developer who's open to this idea, because they can help you when you get stuck in projects. They can support you along the way. And that helps keep momentum in your projects, which is good for your motivation. And of course, it's also good for them because it makes the whole process more inclusive. So they get a technical say very early on in the project, which helps avoid impossible problems later.
Now, when you are that developer who is working with a designer who's starting to get designing in code, first of all, just give them a hug. But realize that you have to be patient. You may have to explain something more than once. When I was working with Adrian in these 6 months, I had my fair shares of, what the fuck is going on here? So I asked him, hey, I have this file here in SAS. Why did you extend the H1? Is that really a good idea?
In my defense, it seemed like a great idea at the time. But he explained it, and I now know why. And when you do start, try to start with a clean slate, because it's easier than to start with legacy files like old Photoshop files that you have to work off.
Yes, because moving from a static comp to code, that's going to be very hard and costly. You basically have to do the same work twice, and nobody's going to pay you for that. It may be viable for long-term projects where you will generate long-term income. Now, when you design in code, you're going to need a way to share all these cool things you make. You need a way to collaborate with developers and maybe other designers. And that's where version control comes in. We use Git, but there are other version control systems out there that work really well. But these systems allow you to work together on a code level. And that actually makes the iteration we mentioned earlier possible. In practice, this is what we do. Whenever we create a new feature or a new element, we branch. And then we run through different funnel steps. And in the end, we end up with production-ready code, and we merge it into our production line, and then we will ship it.
So let's recap. Designing in code is basically about worrying about functions before we worry about how something looks. And we do that in order to deliver the best user experience possible.
And designing code is about communication. With designing code, we speak a common language, and that means there will be a lot less misunderstanding and way less frustration.
And designing in code is about collaboration. And I mean real collaboration, where we work on the same stuff at the same time together. Because that means that we get to solve problems together, and generally, two heads are better at that than one.
And designing code is about bridging the gap. For developer, that means that you will understand the decision process, because you were involved from the beginning. And for designers, that means that you will get to understand limitation at a very early stage. But there is also a bright side to this. You will also see the possibility at a very early stage. Basically, this means that we can use each other's in-depth knowledge of our respective fields to do the best work we can.
And ultimately, designing in code is about reaching goals most efficiently. Because why do we get up in the morning? Why do we go to work? Do we go there to get stuck in a workflow that doesn't really fit us? You know, the one where designers constantly get their work misunderstood, and where developers are basically forced to solve impossible problems? Or would we prefer to make things better for ourselves? I'm not talking about making better products, because let's be honest, we all want to make better products. But I'm talking about a better way of working. And that's ultimately what it's really about. Work better together.
My name is Flurin, and I'm a front-end developer.
And I'm Adrian, and I'm a designer.
Now, if you want to listen to more of our ramblings about code,
or design,
or UX,
or the internet in general,
we're doing a regular webcast. It's called Dev and Designer, so look us up on YouTube.
Please do, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great talk, right? One thing that's not really clear to me, so you think that designing in code is a good idea?
What's your opinion on that?
I have no opinion. I did, but that's not what this is about. What this is about is questions. Yes, we've got several. Hold on.
So when I work as a developer together with designers, I have my own toolchain or the toolchain of my project or application environment, and we use our kind of code, which might be quite different of the code used by other teams and other applications. So someone uses less, someone uses Sass, someone uses plain CSS, and either if they don't match with the designer, you still will have this gap. So the designer then would either have to learn the tools that you use, or you still can't use what he does, because if he gives you plain HTML and you use less, you have to convert it to something else, and if he comes again with a change, you can't use it anymore. So how would you bridge this gap between the different, let's say, codes?
Well, the thing is, it would be fairly easy to say just don't have different codes, but what we actually do is we iterate. So when we build something new, or when we make a change to an application or a website, we let the designer start out in that branch and start something, and he can maybe creates just a separate CSS file when you're still using less. That's perfectly valid. But when you iterate through the process, the developers will slowly move that code into their less set. And when you're done with that feature or that change, you will merge it back, and that's where the whole branching process in version control comes in. So that's really important to get designers on board with version control.
Although it does help to have conventions in like what technologies you use. So, and especially if you start a new project, that's like really easy. You can just start anew and sort of agree on what you want to use. So.
I think there was another one.
How did you handle regressions over the next iterations in your code?
Well, within the funnel, there you will handle regression when you're building the production code, because you want to, as we said, you want to start out with as least cost as possible. So you want to have a lot of ideas, and ultimately, before you were going to ship, you're going to do quality assurance. You will make sure that there is no regression and things like that. So eventually, the CSS the designers create, or the HTML designers create, may never end up in your final product because they were refactored by the developers before it is shipped. So the whole testing happens before you merge again. Does that answer your question, or? We use different kind. Yeah, well, there's not really talk about tools, but we use, for instance, a tool that makes screenshots before and after and compares them and to see what changed. And that way we can really do that on large sets of pages. That's a way, but we have also manual testing where we just look, does it still work, etc.
Other questions? Way in the back. How do you, the question for the streaming as well is, how do you calculate your costs?
When you do a separate, when you have like, first we do the design, and then we have the cost for design, and then we're going to do development.
Actually, usually when we start projects, we are also prefacing that with a research phase in which we will also create requirements. And it's, of course, a matter of experience where we can guess how much time would we need to reach a certain level or meet a certain requirement. So, does that answer it? I'm sorry.
Yeah, because I'm going to hook in on that a little bit. But what Adrian says is there is some research, and that's basically also the thin top layer of the idea gathering stage. Because we are going to look at, okay, we're going to make something. So what would that entail? And that means that we also have some way of saying, okay, we can do the design, and the development will cost about this. But what we also do is tell the client, okay, we can now tell you what the design is going to be cost for the first thing, but we will need support from the designer when we're going to develop, because we need him on board there as well. So that's a way how we kind of navigate around that if the client really wants to have a split in there.
Other questions? No. I just want to say, yes.
If you mostly work on websites, I can understand that the designer also get this website more or less quickly up and running. Whenever you start out with a bigger framework like Rails, some Java, whatever, then it's quite tricky to get that stuff up and running and to have it again run when you leave it for half a year or whatever. So how's your process that the developer can really work and on the same code base, the designer, as the coder does, because it is sometimes tricky.
Yeah, I can understand, especially when you have to, like, for instance, if you have work on a Drupal site, that's exactly the same thing. But what we try to do is we keep front end and design we make a style guide, and that's where the thing between the designer and the front end developer happens. We are not going to have the designer directly work in our application.
Would you say that that's a danger of this process? Is that like some of the questions we've had are kind of development centric, that it becomes another like development process before the development process?
Yeah, if you don't watch it carefully, that can be an issue. But the thing is, when you work together and you have the front-end developer that works together with the designer, also works with the development team. So that means that the front-end developer is really important in this process, that he is going to be the guy that talks to all of the different people. I think it just makes the job of the front-end developer even more important.
What about the other direction? It seems like your approach tries to pull over the designer to the developer side, which calls for specific skills that not every designer might have. If you go to interactions, you might have to have algorithmic skills. First of all, you filter to a very specific subset of designers that would be appropriate for this process. The second is, in your experience, does it work both ways? Does the developer appreciate it? Does the developer get progressively a designer mindset?
Maybe that's best answered by you.
I think so, especially because if you document your process really well, developers can better anticipate what I as a designer intended. So the idea is also that they have to give me fewer calls or fewer messages on Slack asking, hey man, what did you mean by this? Or how do I best implement this idea that you have? So we are looking for developers to also sort of create a certain design feel, so they know what designers actually mean when they create something.
And also, it's much easier for us developers to, okay, he has done the hover, it's defined here, so I can apply that to another button as well, or to another link or something else. So that it just makes the whole process more inclusive. That means you're not moving the designer closer to developer, you're also moving the developer closer to the designer. It's more where in the middle you come together. Did that answer your question? Yes, exactly. Or you're going? Yeah, can you repeat that? So the question is, if we have two different repositories in Git, for instance, when you have one, you have the Drupal site, and in the other repository, you have the design code or the design. And actually, the answer is yes. But there is a small distinction. It's not only the designer that works in the front-end repository. That's also the work where the front-end developer is going to work. And a thing we see most often, because if you're using a certain Drupal module, for instance, it will dictate what HTML comes out. And what we do is then we get that HTML and put it in the front-end package. And that also means that the designer can instantly work with that. That's about the technical limitations. You just work with something that we can actually implement and implement easy. So that means there will be no more conversion, because in the past we had problems where someone designed a form and then used the Drupal form module, and there was no fit. So that's kind of also a thing of the past.
Does the technology, like let's say Drupal, if that's used, does that limit what the designer does?
Yes, it does. The question is that a bad thing? Because if I make something, and let's say I give it to Flurin, and Flurin has his client who says, we have to use Drupal. And I just make something, and I kind of ignore that, and I give it to Flurin, he will not be happy. And he'll probably come back to me and have to do it again. And I won't understand up front, what am I actually working in? How big is the fishbowl that I'm working in? So, yeah.
There's also, if I can interject, so I happen to love this subject, as some of you might know. There's also the fact that if you were doing print design, you're limited as far as what size you can work in, what paper you're working. If you're working for a publication, you have to know a lot about what the ink does with the paper, for example, so that you know exactly what types of images you can use and how you edit them. So those kind of constraints are pretty normal in design processes. And if one of your constraints is Drupal form module, for example, that's just one of the constraints you work within as a designer, generally. So sorry I took that.
That's cool. Totally agree with you. Makes my job very easy.
Other questions?